Good time of the day, dear participants, dear students of our today's lecture. Today we're going to talk about the development of the 20th century, which is associated with the development of Victorian age. Well, first we will focus on introduction to the 19th century British realism, pre-Victorian influence by Jane Austen, Victorian realism and social critique of Charles Dickens, William Makepeace Thackeray, tragic realism by Thomas Hardy and Oscar Wilde. Additionally, we'll talk about Lewis Carroll and his fantasy and nonsense literature, importance of adventure by Rudyard Kipling and their long-lasting influence on the further development of English literature. English realism dates back to 18th century, but it's developed and reached the highest peak in the 19th century. The development of political situation, development of industrialization, economy and social condition in the lives of British literature and British community made new writers of this era to quest for new phenomenon of the life, like social scenery, the political conditions, and philosophical depths. Victorian literature is relevant to the reign of Queen Victoria, which lasted from 1837 to 1901. Written during the reign of this queen, reflects the immense social, industrial and political changes of the 19th century. It is characterized by its focus on morality, social issues, realism and the conflict between tradition and progress. The key characteristics of Victorian literature are realism and social criticism, a realistic approach to the depiction of the real-life conditions, and more real protagonists that really differ from the previous century's protagonists that depict honorable, honored and perfect main heroes in the novels. And besides the affects and impact of social harsh conditions, social classes, class distinctions, rigid social regulations and norms of Victorian age. Industrialization and class struggles. With the development of industrialization, there were really strict divisions between different classes, and their struggles are portrayed and explored in these realistic novels. Morality and hypocrisy. Writers of this era really questioned the British morality, rigid conventions during this era, hypocrisy of the higher and upper class societies, women's role in society, women with the development of printing press and development of education earned a new role and new status in the society, and with the increase of women writers, they determined the role of women in society and questioned the imposed regulations and restrictions to females during this era. The supernatural and Gothic revival. In this kind of novels, authors usually blended supernatural magic with the use of new linguistic structures, puzzles and riddles. Colonialism and the British Empire was portrayed with the development of British Empire, its colonies, the pride for British Empire and consequences of colonialism. The key Victorian writers and their contribution. Let's start with the work of Jane Austen. Jane Austen's works associated with the Regency era is considered not Victorian but pre-Victorian era. But her impact on the literature wasn't only confined by Regency era, it lasted even in the Victorian era and had a great influences in such works, in such British writers like Charles Dickens, Sister Brontes, George Eliot and many others. Well, although Jane Austen wrote during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, she significantly influenced Victorian literature, particularly in the depiction of social class, marriage, and gender roles. Her novel offers sharp social critique, emphasizing themes of morality, manners, and personal growth within a rigidly structured society. Austen's heroines are intelligent, independent, and often challenge societal expectations while navigating their complexities of love and duty. Themes and literary style in the works of Jane Austen: social class and marriage. Jane Austen questioned economic and social situations of people, particularly women, in the marriage. Female agency. Jane Austen questioned rigid conventions and restrictions imposed by Victorian society toward females. Irony and society. With free and indirect social discourse, Jane Austen easily portrayed the irony and corruption and hypocrisy of the society during this era. Moral growth. Usually, the main protagonists in the novels of Jane Austen struggle with their moral growth, with balancing their desires and earning respect, gaining virtuous features of humanity. And usually main protagonists have this step-based moral growth in these novels. One of the prominent and timeless exploration of love, social class, and self-awareness was depicted in The Pride and Prejudice, which was written in 1813. Here, the main protagonist, Elizabeth Bennet, overcomes personal prejudices and navigates societal expectations to find happiness with Mr. Darcy. Another prominent novel is called Sense and Sensibility, with very different two main protagonists, practical Eleanor and impulsive Marianne. They experience love and heartbreak, ultimately demonstrating the necessity of balance between sense and sensibility. The next famous novel is called Emma. It is a comedic but very insightful novel about a wealthy young woman, Emma Woodhouse, who, by misguiding attempts in matching, encounters very interesting situations by, at the same time, aligning personal growth and unexpected romance. The next prominent author is Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is one of the most celebrated and influential novelists of the Victorian era, known for his vivid storytelling, memorable characters, and powerful social critiques. His works exposed to harsh realities of industrialization, poverty, and the struggles of the working class, making him a literary champion for social reforms. Themes and literary style of Charles Dickens include social injustice. Charles Dickens was first English writer who exposed readers to the child labor, debt, prison, and injustice towards orphan orphan children who usually wander in streets and live in different slums and face different harsh conditions of the child labor. Critique of institutions. At the same time, Charles Dickens also criticized the legal and political institutions of British society. Realism and sentimentalism. Realistic situation is portrayed in combination with melancholy, melodrama, some emotional struggles of the main protagonists in these novels, and memorable characters like Oliver Twist, Ebenezer, Mrs. Havisham are considered as literary icons written by Charles Dickens. Notable works: Oliver Twist, a grim portrayal of child labor, poverty and crime, following the journey of orphan who struggles to survive in a ruthless world, which is written during the 1837 to 1839. The next prominent novel is David Copperfield. It's considered a semi-autobiographical novel, and is considered, and Charles Dickens in this novel deeply explored the themes of perseverance, personal growth and ambition. Bleak House, a powerful critique of the British legal systems, particularly slow and corrupt of the Chancery, wrapped in a compelling mystery. Here, the court of the Chancery is considered a kind of court where they had to impose the alleviation towards people who were sentenced, who were imprisoned, but because of corruption and illegal condition in this Chancery court, there were a lot of attempts in compelling mystery to make these sentences to be prolonged, and people even waited for the resolution of the Chancery court for decades. The next novel is Great Expectation. Is considered a psychological novel that examines ambition, social mobility and personal redemption through the experience of its main protagonist, Pip. All his attempts in earning the money and getting the heritage for the sake of getting attention of his lovely girl was useless, and he identifies his true love, and it is also considered one of the psychological novel with the psychological struggles of the main protagonist of Pip. Dickens' works continue to be widely read and adapted, remaining relevant due to their timeless critique and social inequality and human resilience. His ability to blend realism with emotional depth makes him cornerstone of Victorian literature. Next authors named William Makepeace Thackeray is considered a satirical realist, was one of the foremost realist writers of the 19th century, known for his sharp satire and unromanticized portrayal of society. Unlike Dickens, who normally portrayed the harsh conditions of poor and lower class community, William Makepeace Thackeray made a deep exploration of the lives of higher and upper classes. His works focus on flawed, self-serving characters rather than noble heroes, making his novels some of the most realistic depictions of human nature in Victorian literature. His notable works are Vanity Fair, a novel without the hero. Here, in this novel, he portrays and makes a deep exploration of society driven by greed, ambition and self-interest. It follows two contrasting women. First, Becky Sharp, who is cunning and resourceful, who uses wit and charm to climb the social ladder, and her antagonist is Amelia Sadley, is a passive and naive woman who represents traditional feminine virtue but lacks agency. Here, William Makepeace Thackeray portrays how the instilled traditional feminine virtue to become a naive reflects women's life in the negative way. Thackeray presents irony and narrative commentary. Thackeray frequently addresses the reader, exposing human weaknesses with biting humor. Regarding historical realism, real events such as the Battle of Waterloo is associated with the fall of the King Napoleon, the French King Napoleon, and this battle is intervened to the real stories in his novels, and which makes his novels historically relevant. Flawed, complex characters. Unlike previous era literature, his heroes are not notable figures, but people who is not entirely good or entirely wise, challenging the ideas of idealized hero. Critique of social ambition. The novel highlights how wealth and status dictates relationship and the morality of the 19th century. The next author is Thomas Hardy, who is the author of Naturalism and Tragedy. Naturalism is something that is more than just realism. The naturalist writers depict real conditions, real harsh life of people. Despite their social layers, they may be lower class people or middle or upper societies. Thomas Hardy and naturalist writers display the lives and conditions in a very detailed way, with depiction of all harsh conditions, and mainly these writers are more pessimistic rather than optimistic. That's why most of Thomas Hardy's novels end in a tragic way. His works often challenge the rigid moral codes of Victorian society, portraying life as governed by an indifferent fate rather than human will. And he tries to portray that people are in different uncontrolled situations and a kind of victims of their fate and destiny. Victorian realism and the emerging modernist movement was inspired by the works of Thomas Hardy, and we can say with the experimentation of different use of language structure, different psychological struggles, deep psychological struggles of main protagonists made a germ to the development of modernist literature in the next century. Themes and literary style, fate and determinism. The main characters in the works of Thomas Hardy are in an uncontrollable situation, which is defined by fate and destiny, or with instilled, imposed regulations of the society of British society during this era. Critique of Victorian morality. Here, with such a craft, Thomas Hardy depicts the Victorian hypocrisy, political corruption, and dullness and flawness of people during this era. Rural life and industrialization. Here, the author makes a deep exploration of how rural life, conventional rural life, was impacted and affected with the development of industrialization. Tragic realism. Most protagonists in the works of Thomas Hardy ends up with tragic situation, which was uncontrolled and was affected with destiny. Notable works: Tess of the D'Urberville, a depiction of the woman who has a tragic end and was executed by the British court because of the hypocrisy and harsh social conditions that was imposed towards female. All restrictions made the Tess, the main protagonist in this novel, choose very ambiguous choices and to be executed at the end of the novel. The almost same fate had also Jude the Obscure. It is also the Jude whose ambitions towards education, towards finding a place in a society, in a community, was collapsed with the destiny, with fate, and imposed restrictions of the society. Hardy's works were controversial in his time due to their critical view of marriage, religion, and class structure. But despite this controversy, he gained a great popularity. Oscar Wilde's asceticism and satire is related to this author. was one of the most flamboyant and witty writers of the Victorian era, known for his sharp social commentary, satirical plays, and devotion to the aesthetic movement. And one of his famous logos was art for the sake of art. He always considered art shouldn't teach people a moral. Art should be something different from the moral, something different from something didactic. And art, literature and culture shouldn't teach people community, but people should take inspiration. And this inspiration shouldn't be only educational, but also should be aesthetic. This was one of the main important ideologies of Oscar Wilde, as he was an aesthete, and main ideologies of aestheticism that started to develop during the 19th century by the first works of Oscar Wilde. Themes and literary styles, aestheticism and the role of art. Wilde believed in the separation art from morality, advocating beauty and artistic expression above all else. Satire of Victorian society. His works mock social conventions, particularly hypocrisy, rigid class distinctions, and moral double standards, such as something that was praised for men was condemned when it was done by women. This was a kind of double standard which was criticized by Oscar Wilde in his novels. Or one of the common phenomena in the literature during this era is a rigid class distinctions. With the development of economy and industrialization, as I mentioned, there was a strict class distinctions between poor people and wealth people, politicians and middle class, and their struggles to balance their life, to establish communication between these classes are portrayed in the works of these writers. Wit and epigrams. Oscar Wilde is considered one of the witty writers who used a different stylistic and linguistic devices in his works, which made a great influence in the development of particular literary style based on Oscar Wilde's works, like using paradoxes, different stylistic devices, puns, inversions. This was one of the distinctive features of Oscar Wilde's works. Duality and hidden identity. Most protagonists of Oscar Wilde's novels usually struggle to balance their identities between their desires and gaining outward respectability. Notable works: The Picture of Dorian Gray, a Gothic novel exploring vanity, hedonism and moral corruption, in which a young man remains eternally youthful while his portrait bears marks of his sin. The next work, The Importance of Being Earnest, a brilliant comedic satire of Victorian manners and hypocrisy, revolving around mistaken identities and absurd social conventions. Oscar Wilde, in 1895, his literary career collapsed because of the strict court sentence. He was imprisoned for 2 years for his untraditional orientation, and this imprisonment made a great impact on the collapse of Oscar Wilde and led him to his death at the age of 46. Lewis Carroll, the author of fantasy and nonsense literature, a pen name of Charles Ludwig Dodgson, was a Victorian writer, mathematician and logician, best known for his whimsically and imaginative works that have captivated readers of all ages. His stories blend fantasy with clever wordplay, logical puzzles and social satire, making him both entertaining and intellectually stimulating. The main themes in the works of Lewis Carroll are nonsense and absurdity. Well, the works of Lewis Carroll was devoted for the children audience, but these fairy tales were totally different. And here, nonsense and absurdity were presented by the different puzzles, riddles that are presented in the dialects between eccentric characters in these fairy tales, which made Lewis Carroll's fairy tales are revolutionary for children's literature. Logic and mathematics. As Lewis Carroll was mathematician, this background make a great impact on his works like Alice in Wonderland and others, with implementation of logic, different structures, the use of puzzles and riddles with logical structure. This was the influence of math in the novels. Satire and Victorian society, with blending the logic, blending the supernatural things, magic, and the use of witty language. Lewis Carroll subtly criticized the British adulthood, its education and social situation in his fairy tales. Wordplay and linguistic creativity. Lewis Carroll was one of the literary writers who created new language chunks, new words and different styles of expressing their ideas and description of the dialects. Notable works are Alice in Wonderland, a fantastic tale following Alice as she falls down a rabbit hole into a dreamlike world, filled with eccentric characters and illogical events, exploring themes of identity, curiosity, and absurdity. Here, in this novel, Alice tries to criticize the absurdity of the outer world from the point of view of children. Unlike before written fairy tales for children audience, which were mostly didactic and advisory, Lewis Carroll's fairy tale Alice in Wonderland wasn't advisory. Here, despite any kind of imposed regulations of adults, child Alice becomes her own, remains sticking to her own ideas and ideologies, and doesn't change her identity despite adults' regulations. Here, Lewis Carroll doesn't want to portray adulthood as a fool or dull, but wants to make children to be more creative and analytical or critical towards different situations. For example, we can see it in the example when the teacher of Alice in the fairy tale wants to teach a moral instead of moral, and Alice resists her teacher and doesn't want to learn this subject. These kind of situations make children to be more critical and develop their critical thinking abilities, analytical abilities that were something new and revolutionary in fairy tales of the 19th century that are written by Lewis Carroll. His next fairy tale is Through the Looking Glass, which was written in 1874, is a kind of the opposition to his first novel. Here, when in Alice in Wonderland, everything is presented in chaos, and in Through the Looking Glass, a sequel where Alice pans through a mirror into a chessboard-like world, featuring wordplay, satire, famous poems, and Jabberwocky. Here, in this fairy tale, everything is overly regulated, overly strict. Everything, especially adults, every member in this wonderland are obeying particular rules and regulations, which, from the point of Alice, considered to be ridiculous and useless. And even some talks that and dialogues which are presented by the adults considered as ridiculous and senseless. She just makes a resistance to listen to them. And he doesn't, and here Lewis Carroll wants to say that not everything that is said by adults can be true, can be correct. It's not necessary to follow all regulations, all advices of the adulthood. Sometimes something that is told and imposed by adults should be questioned, challenged by making critical analysis and challenging these ideas. Lewis Carroll's unique approach to storytelling and language continues to inspire literature, art, and popular culture, securing his legacy as a pioneer of imaginative fiction. Rudyard Kipling was one of the most intellectual writers of the 19th century and early 20th century, known for his vivid storytelling, themes of British imperialism, and exploration of adventure and moral philosophy. He was deeply connected to British colonial rule, having been born in India, which greatly influenced his works. His writing often reflected both admiration for the British Empire and a complex understanding of colonialism's consequences. The main themes explored by Rudyard Kipling: imperialism and the white man's burden, as if for Rudyard Kipling the colonialism and imperialism of the British Empire had particular burden, and British men had particular responsibility over their colonies. Cultural exchange and identity. As native country of Rudyard Kipling was India, that's why his main protagonists expressed different cultural experiences in different countries of West and East. Adventure and survival. Many protagonists in the Rudyard Kipling's novels are young men who have a lot of adventures and struggle for their existence and survival. Moral lessons and stoicism, with experiences of different harsh conditions, struggling for survival, made by these kind of experiences, the characters in the novels of Rudyard Kipling got moral lessons and developed stoicism in their feature and nature. Notable works are Mowgli, A Boy, The Jungle Book, Fables of Colonialism and Survival. Here the protagonist is Mowgli, is considered a member of British colony, who is here. In this novel we can notice a short and little incline to the metaphor of colonialism. The main representative of this Jungle Book is Mowgli, is considered to be as a British man, as if he appears in India, and jungle is a new colony. Here the main protagonist tries to adapt to new rules and regulations of the jungle, which is considered an Indian jungle. And Baloo and Bagheera, his mentors, representing different approaches to wisdom and survival. The members of the new community, as if teach new members of this community how to adapt and survive. Shere Khan, the antagonist of symbolizing danger and opposition to order. Seems the balance between freedom and responsibility, the idea of civilization versus nature, leadership and the right to rule. Notable works is another notable work is If, a poem of resilience and stoicism, which was written in 1895. If is associated with the loss of his son, the son of Rudyard Kipling, and this poem is devoted for his son, and epitomizes the man's masculinity. The famous poem, written as advice from a father to a son, embodies Victorian ideals of self-discipline, perseverance and moral strength. It became symbol of British masculinity and leadership. Key themes explored in the If are maintaining composure in adversity, taking responsibility for one's action, staying humble despite success, the power of determination and endurance. In conclusion, we can say that the Victorian era produced some of the most influential writers of English literature. Each contributed distinct themes and styles that shaped the literary landscape. For example, Jane Austen pioneered social commentary by defining female gender roles and questioning rigid restrictions imposed towards female community. Charles Dickens exposed such deep and rigid questions like child labor and poverty. William Thackeray critiqued ambition and hypocrisy of higher and middle-class people. Oscar Wilde satirized society with wit and elegance. Lewis Carroll transformed children's fairy tales into a kind of revolutionary fairy tales that made children more critical analytics. Rudyard Kipling captured imperial adventure and legacy. Together, these authors defined the complexities of their time, addressing social change, morality, identity, and imagination, ensuring their works remain timeless and relevant even today. Thank you for your attention. I hope this lecture was useful and informative for you. See you in the next lectures. Goodbye.